First, let's look at a few keywords associated with a normal landing. After the base to final turn is complete, the longitudinal axis of the aircraft should be aligned with the extended center line of the runway. At this point, a stable glide should be established and an aiming point selected. The aiming point should be kept in the center of the windshield and the approach glide controlled with power. If the aiming point moves up in the windshield, you will be landing before the aiming point and you will need to add power to lengthen the glide. If the aiming point moves down in the windshield, you will be landing beyond the aiming point and you will need to reduce power to shorten the glide. If the aiming point is kept in the center of the windshield, you should arrive at a height of 10 to 20 feet above the aiming point. As the aircraft reaches this height, the round out or flare should be started. Back pressure on the elevator should be gradually applied to slowly increase the pitch attitude and angle of attack. This will cause the aircraft's nose to gradually rise to the desired landing attitude. The angle of attack should be increased at a rate which will allow the aircraft to slowly settle as the forward speed decreases. The touchdown is a gentle settling of the aircraft onto the runway and should be made with the engine idling and the aircraft at minimum controllable airspeed. Now let's look at two normal landings, first at Blairstown, New Jersey, and then at East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. Here we are, completing the base to final turn at Blairstown Airport. At this point, the extended center line of the runway will be aligned with the longitudinal axis of the aircraft. I now have a glide established with a constant descent rate. I have selected the aiming point of the hash marks at the approach end of the runway. I will keep the aiming point in the center of the windshield by either adding power if the aiming point moves up in the windshield, or reducing power if the aiming point moves down in the windshield. As I reach the end of the runway at a height of 10 to 20 feet, I start the flare by gradually pulling back on the control yoke to raise the nose of the aircraft to the desired landing attitude. As the aircraft slows, I continue to pull back on the control yoke, flying about a foot off the runway until the wings stall and the aircraft touches down on the runway. Here we are completing the base to final turn at East Stroudsburg Airport. You will notice that the runway is much narrower than that of Blairstown. Regardless, everything remains the same. The extended center line of the runway will be aligned with the longitudinal axis of the aircraft. I have established a glide with a constant descent rate. Again, I select the aiming point of the hash marks on the runway. The difference here is that there is a displaced threshold and the hash marks are further down the runway from the approach end. Still, I will keep the aiming point in the center of the windshield by either adding power if the aiming point moves up in the windshield or reducing power if the aiming point moves down in the windshield. As I reach the aiming point at a height of 10 to 20 feet, I start the flare by gradually pulling back on the control yoke to raise the nose of the aircraft to the desired landing attitude. We have a little crosswind from the right, so I need to correct for that. As the airspeed slows, I continue to pull back on the control yoke, flying about a foot off the runway until the wings stall and the aircraft touches down on the runway. Now, let's recap the landing fundamentals. The longitudinal axis of the aircraft is aligned with the extended center line of the runway. The glide is kept at a constant rate of descent, using power to keep the selected aiming point in the center of the windshield. Start your flare at a height of 10 to 20 feet above the runway. If all is well, touchdown will be on the runway as the wings stall. Happy landings!